In 2025, scientists did something that had failed for decades. They read the entire genome of a man who died in Egypt around 4,500 years ago, in the age when the first pyramids were rising. The first complete ancient Egyptian genome ever. And most of what they found was exactly what you would expect. He was, for the most part, local, North African, a son of the Nile, but not all of him. Roughly a fifth of his ancestry did not come from Africa at all. It traced to Mesopotamia, modern Iraq, the land of Sumer, of the first cities, of cuneiform. The one other place on Earth that, at almost the same moment in history, had independently invented writing, kings, and civilization itself. For over a century, archaeologists had noticed the two worlds echoing each other and argued about why. Was it trade, copied ideas, or had actual people moved between them? This skeleton, in a pot, in a museum in Liverpool, just answered the question. And the answer had been sitting in a clay jar the whole time. Here is how they pulled a 4,500-year-old secret out of a tooth, and why one number in it rewrote a story we thought we understood. Start with why this had never been done before. DNA is fragile. Heat and water tear it apart. And Egypt is one of the hardest places on Earth to recover it. Because Egypt is hot, and the Nile made it humid. Decades of trying had produced almost nothing. The best earlier attempt, in 2017, recovered only fragments of mitochondrial DNA, a tiny slice of the full picture, and none of it from this deep in time. There was a second problem, and it is the great irony of Egyptology. Mummification, the thing Egypt is famous for, is terrible for DNA. The removal of organs, the drying salts, the resins, all of it degrades the genetic material you would want to read, which is exactly why this man was different. He was not mummified. He was buried in the older way, before embalming became standard. His body was placed intact inside a large ceramic pot and sealed in a rock-cut tomb in a cliff at a place called Nuweirat, about 260 kilometers south of Cairo. That pot and that cliff did what no laboratory could. Stable temperature, no embalming chemicals, a sealed microclimate. For 4,500 years, it kept just enough of him intact. He was dug up in 1902 by a British archaeologist named John Garstang, shipped to Liverpool and put in a museum. And then he waited. He sat on a shelf through both World Wars. A bombing raid in the Second World War reportedly destroyed other human remains in that very collection. His pot survived. Over a century later, researchers took a single tooth, not the enamel, the root, where a tissue called cementum locks cells away for life. From that, using shotgun sequencing, they read him, all of him. So who was he? Before the DNA, the bones already told a story. An adult male, short by our standards, around 160 centimeters, brown-eyed, dark-skinned, dark-haired, by the forensic predictions from his DNA. So far, an ordinary Egyptian of his age. But his skeleton was not ordinary. It was worn in a very specific way. His bones carried the marks of heavy, repetitive physical labor. Arms held out in front of him, back leaning forward, hips seated for long hours. The pattern of a body that spent its life doing one demanding thing over and over. The researchers had a candidate for what that thing was. A potter. A man who spent his days bent over a wheel, shaping clay. And here is the quiet heartbreak in it. A manual laborer. a workman's body. Yet he was buried in a rock-cut tomb, sealed in a fine pot, given a resting place that took real effort and status to arrange. A working man given an elite grave. We do not know why. Maybe he was very good. Maybe he was loved. The tomb kept that secret, even as it gave up the genetic one. So this is the man, local by every expectation. A potter on the Nile in the Pyramid Age. Everything about him says he belonged to exactly one world. And then they read the genome, and a fifth of him belonged to another. Reading a genome is only half the work. The other half is comparison. You take this man's DNA and you test it against the genetic signatures of ancient populations from across the region. You are asking a single question. Where do the pieces of him come from? Most of the answer was calm and expected. About 78% of his ancestry matched Neolithic North Africa, the deep local population of the Nile and the lands west of it. His majority story is exactly the story you would have written for him in advance. It was the other slice that stopped them. The remaining 22% did not match the North African population. It did not simply match the nearby Levant, the coastal strip just to the east, which would have been the easy, unremarkable answer. It matched, most closely, the eastern Fertile Crescent, Mesopotamia, the floodplain of the Tigris and the Euphrates, more than 1,000 kilometers away. Sit with what that means. Two river valleys, two of the first great civilizations humanity ever produced. Both of them, at roughly the same time, inventing writing from nothing, Egypt drawing hieroglyphs, Mesopotamia pressing cuneiform into clay, both building cities and crowning kings while most of the planet was still villages. For more than 100 years, scholars had stared at the resemblances between them. Similar cylinder seals, similar recessed mud brick architecture, motifs that seemed to travel. And they had argued, without ever being able to settle it, over one word: contact. Look closer at what they were staring at. Cylinder seals. A small carved stone rolled across wet clay to leave a signature used in both worlds. Mud brick walls built with deep recessed niches, the same distinctive facade standing in both places. And on the artifacts from the age of Narmer, at the very dawn of the Egyptian state, motifs that also appear in the East. Each parallel, on its own, is arguable. A trader carries a seal, a builder copies a wall he liked. And that was always the problem. Every single piece of it could be explained without one person ever moving. Did these two worlds actually touch? Did people move between them, carrying blood as well as ideas? Or did each just hear rumors of the other and copy what it liked? You cannot copy a genome by trade. You cannot imitate ancestry. The 22% in this man's DNA is not an idea that traveled. It is people who traveled. Ancestors of his who, somewhere in the centuries before he was born, made the journey from the land between the rivers to the valley of the Nile and stayed. This is the first genetic evidence that the two founding civilizations of the Near East were not just neighbors who admired each other from a distance. They were, in part, the same people. Now the discipline, because this is where a story like this usually gets ruined. This is one man, one genome, one pot, from one town, from one slice of time. It is tempting to leap straight to the ancient Egyptians came from Iraq, and that leap would be wrong. 78% of him is local. He is, overwhelmingly, a son of the Nile, who happened to also carry a deep Eastern inheritance. What one skeleton cannot tell you is how common that inheritance was. Was this man typical or unusual? Did a fifth of everyone around him carry Mesopotamian ancestry, or was he a rare case? One genome cannot answer that. You would need dozens, hundreds, from different places and centuries to draw the real map. But here is why this one still matters enormously. It is the first. For decades, the question of Egyptian origins was argued on pottery styles and architecture and guesswork, because the DNA simply would not survive to be read. Now, a door that was welded shut has opened by a crack. One genome proves it can be done, and proves that at least one real person embodied the link that scholars could only infer, and Egypt's museums and cliffs are full of the unmummified dead. The ordinary people buried the old way, in pots, before embalming. Every one of them is a potential genome. This man is not the end of the story. He is the first sentence of a book we could not read until now. So the 22% is not the final answer about who the Egyptians were. It is something better. It is proof the question can finally be asked properly. Step back and look at what actually happened here. A working man, a potter, died on the Nile around the time the first pyramids climbed out of the desert. His people gave him a grave better than his hands deserved, and sealed him in a clay pot. That pot outlasted the pyramids' builders, outlasted the pharaohs, outlasted the empire, outlasted the language. It survived being dug up by Victorians, shipped across a continent, and sitting through the bombing of a city. And when we finally learnt to read what was locked in the root of his tooth, he told us something no monument ever could. That the two civilizations we treat as separate origins of the modern world, the Nile and the land between the rivers, were joined, in the flesh, in at least one man, 4,500 years ago. Everyone who studied him for a century saw a local potter. His DNA saw a 1,000-kilometer journey his ancestors made before he was born. A journey no text recorded and no monument marked, carried silently in his blood into a pot in a cliff, and held there until we were finally clever enough to hear it. The dead do not stop talking. We just spent 4,500 years unable to listen. If you want more of history, read out of the evidence itself. That is what this channel does. Subscribe, and I will show you the next thing the bones remember.